Go to this week's portion, which is Parashas Tzav, and Parashas Tzav is followed by Shabbos. It's followed by Pesach this year, so there's a lot of discussion about what the proper way to observe Shabbos this week is, because we have the Seder that night. So most synagogues around the world, what they'll do is we daven very, very early this Shabbos, so that one could eat their first meal, but while it's still allowed to eat the chametz. In DC, that's at 10:18 a.m. And also they could then bench and have the third meal of the day also before the time that one eats chametz. So they could eat two meals before 10:18. That's what most synagogues do. But you could also, since you're not allowed to eat chametz after 10:18, there's another possibility, and that other possibility is to eat egg matzah. Egg matzah is what's called matzah ashira. That technically it's called or I guess ashir means rich. So one of the ways people translate it is wealthy matzah. What does that mean, wealthy matzah? It means matzah is technically speaking flour and water. So let's say you add juice to it. It's flour and juice. So is that okay? So the Ashkenazic practice, the Sephardim eat the egg matzah. The whole Pesach. The Ashkenazic practice is that you're only allowed to eat the egg matzah if you're elderly. In those days, the elderly people had no teeth, and if you are very young. But it's not chametz, so you can eat it on Erev Pesach, and if you eat enough of it, then you can make a motzi and bench on it, and it's not chametz. So therefore, the practice is to eat egg matzah on this Shabbos, and that way you're able to eat your bread for the meal without worrying about eating. And you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to eat chametz, and so therefore you don't have a problem with that. I see that there is a question. Okay, so that's the practice for this Shabbos, and you're supposed to nullify your chametz. Also, you say you're supposed to burn your chametz on Friday, nullify your chametz on Shabbos, and I'm going to actually sell the chametz. If anybody needs to sell their chametz with me, I'm actually going to sell it before I leave town, but on the condition that people are allowed to eat from their chametz up until such time as it's prohibited. So we're selling everything except for what you're going to eat, and we'll do those calculations later. So now we'll go to this week's parsha, which is Parshas Tzav. So Tzav is Leviticus chapter 6, and here too I want to read the first Rashi, and then after we read the first Rashi, I would like to I found this beautiful new book. We were able to receive the library of Fred Summers, who was a big scholar, and I have this beautiful book called Mayana Shel Torah, which is an anthology of commentaries. There's some beautiful explanations, and also just so people know, we're starting three new shelves in the library of our yeshiva. One is the shelf of Rabbi Soloveitchik, another is the shelf of the Chafetz Chaim, and the third is the shelf of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. These are three great scholars in the 20th century. Chavetz Chaim is the first half of the 20th century, and Rabbi Soloveitchik and Lubavitcher Rebbe are the second half, who had such a tremendous impact on tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And so therefore each one gets a shelf in our yeshiva. And we have their literature and their students' literature surrounding them. So if you ever see a great book about the Rebbe, by the Rebbe, about Rabbi Soloveitchik, by Rabbi Soloveitchik, or about the Chafetz Chaim, then bring it and put it on our shelf, and we'll be building up our partnership. Okay, so the verse says, "Vayidaber Hashem Moshe lemor, Tzav es Aaron ve'es banav lemor." Command Aaron and his son, saying, "Zos Torah Ha'olah." This is the law of the Olah. What's the Olah? The Olah is an offering which is entirely burnt. He Ha'olah. This is the offering. An Olah is an elevation offering. It's entirely burnt. Al Mokdah. It stays on its flame. Now there, the mem is small. Ala Mizbeach kol laila ad haboker. It stays on its flame on the altar all night until the morning. Me'esha Mizbeach tukadbo. And the fire of the altar shall be kept aflame on it. So this is the law that the sacrifice is going to be burning all night long. And after it burns, then the Torah goes into a discussion of what happens when something burns. It becomes ashes, and we remove those ashes, or the Kohen removes those ashes. But before we get to that, we have this verse. It's unusual. The unusual word in this verse is the word tzav, command. That it's not usually the case that this is the word that introduces what God says to Moshe. He usually says, Daber el Aaron, speak to Aaron, or Emor el Aaron, or Emor el Kohanim b'nei Aaron. Here, it says, Tzav, command. It's a very unusual word, and the commentaries focus on it. So that's especially appropriate for us these days, because as we prepare for the holiday of Pesach, that we have to recognize this idea. It says Rashi, Tzav es Aaron, command Aaron. What does that mean? The word command, says Rashi, ein tzav el lashon zeruz. The word tzav indicates urgency. Miyad u'doros. Urgency immediately, and urgency for future generations. All of a sudden, we have a new idea that there's a commandment which has an expression of urgency associated with it. Meaning to say, we have two aspects here. First of all, that actually we have three aspects here. We're being strongly encouraged to do it. Number two, we're supposed to do it immediately. And number three, also future generations have to do it. This idea of urgency in the performance of a religious task is a vital religious value. That, there was one time, I always remember this story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitcher Rebbe says anything worth doing is worth doing right away. Anything worth doing is worth doing right away. That's what the Rebbe says. And the Rebbe, there was a story that the Rebbe was, that somebody called from, a girl called from Detroit, and she said she was learning to light Shabbos candles, and she wanted to know where she could get Shabbos candles. So the Rebbe told asked one of his students to go send her the Shabbos candles. But it was Friday afternoon, Shabbos was in an hour, so he says, okay, I'll just send it on Monday morning when the post office opens up. I'll send it on Monday morning. And the Rebbe said, no, it has to be done right now. That's the urgency, because if you're going to send it Monday, she's going to think that it's not important. It's only important to do it Monday. So basically, in order to impress upon everyone the importance, you have to do it right away. That was the Rebbe's teaching. And so this is the idea of Tzav is an expression of zrizus, of rushing to perform a mitzvah. The mitzvah of matzah is also this idea of zrizus, that you have to rush when you perform the matzah. If the dough is idle for even 1 minute, then it becomes chametz. So chametz represents inactivity or non-activity. When we don't work the dough, when we don't rush along with it, that becomes chametz. Matzah represents something that is done with tremendous urgency. And I'll just finish this Rashi. Amar Rabbi Shimon, biyoser tzarach hakosav ozares b'makom sheyesh bo chisaron kis. When we lose money, when there's a place of financial loss, there we have to especially urge ourselves and so the Kohanim are going to be suffering financial loss here. How so? Because they're not paid for their sacrifices. So therefore, in order to perform the sacrifice, they have to give up their regular means of making a living. And so therefore, usually they're going to eat the meat. But when it comes to an oil offering, that means it's entirely burnt. And so therefore, so they get no meat. So therefore, we're especially urging them about the importance of this mitzvah. Okay, hold on one second. Let's see. Bruce and April have a question. Yes. The question was asked is why is the mem of the word mokdah small? So I have a few answers here in the Mayana Shal Torah. The first was attributed to the Kotzker Rebbe, and then is attributed to the Sfas Emes, and then there's the Beis Yaakov, the Rebbe of Ishbitza. So first, the Kotzker Rebbe says again. The verse is the pasuk tells us. The pasuk tells us, "Hi ha'olah al mokdah al mezbeach kol laila," that this is the olah which goes up al mokdah, which is on its firewood. So the mokdah can be the flame or the firewood kol laila all night until the morning. So this is the olah which goes up on its firewood upon the altar all night until the morning. So it says the Kotzker, the letter mem, mokdah, the letter mem is small to indicate, this is the Kotzker Rebbe. He says to tell us that the fiery zeal of a Jew on behalf of his faith should not be put on exhibit for everybody to see, but should be kept within the heart, away from the public eye. So the mokdah, this fire, which it's going on, is a private fire. Your zeal, our zeal to do the mitzvah, to do the will of God, is supposed to be within ourselves, hidden. I mean, we could show it to our families, but it's supposed to be hidden. There's a similar explanation. The Mayana Shal Torah records this without attribution, and it says in the pasuk above, it says, and the fire of the altar shall be kept alive in it. Meaning to say the fire of the altar was never supposed to go out. So why does he say the Eisham Mizbeach Tukad Bo, and the fire of the altar shall burn within it or on it? So he says Bo can also be, here we're saying the Eisham Mizbeach Tukad Bo, the fire of the altar shall be kept burning next to it or on it. But you could also translate it as bo, meaning within the person, meaning to say that you have to keep the fire of the altar burning inside him, meaning to say not for everybody to see, but for our own personal fire has to be kept alive inside of us. So now we have in this context one more idea about this from the Sfas Emes, and I'll get back to your question. Sure.
Answer the concept.
The Sfas Emes records a beautiful teaching here, powerful teaching. He says as follows. He says, the Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph, and it's like basically right before the Mishnah there in 28a, tells us the story that Hillel the elder had 80 disciples. And the greatest of these 80 disciples was Yonatan ben Uziel, and Yochanan ben Zakkai, of whom we know about that there was no part of Jewish law that he didn't know, was considered the least of them. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, we know, saved the Jewish people. He saved the Talmud because he was the one who went to. He was the one who said, "Give me Yavne and give me Yavne and its scholars." He said that to Vespasian. So, if Yochanan ben Zakkai was the least of all these students of Hillel, who was the greatest? The greatest was Yonatan ben Uziel. This is straight from the Talmud. Sfas Emes hasn't said a word yet. Now, the Gemara says there that Yonatan ben Uziel was so great that as he studied the Torah, any bird which was flying above him while he was studying Torah would be burned to death. That means that he was studying the Torah, he was so on fire that any bird that was flying past him would be burned to death. That's how much passion he had. But, says the Tzvas Emes, Hillel, what do we know about Hillel? We know about Hillel from, he was the one who accepted everybody. He accepted everybody who asked him a question. Learn Shabbos Hagadol tells us that. He loved people. He had patience for people. So it says in Tzvas Emes, what of Hillel himself? Certainly Hillel's greatness was higher than any of his students. And he certainly he studied with a fiery zeal, but no bird flying over Hillel was burnt. No bird, for his greatness lay in the fact, says the Tzvas Emes, that the zeal that it was burning, burnt within him. He kept it between himself and God. Nobody else saw about this passion, this zealousness. The fire was contained within. What a powerful idea. He was not outwardly obtrusive. That's what the Tzvas Emes says about this powerful idea. So that's all stemming from the question. The Mokdah means to say that this fire was burning within. Okay, what a beautiful idea. Now there's a lot more. Hold on, let me just see. Since you asked this question about Mokdah, I want to just check one more source, see if we have anything. Okay. Okay, just before we go back to the parasha, I wanted to go through that this Shabbos is called Shabbas Hagadol. This Shabbos is the last Shabbos before Pesach, and it's called Shabbas Hagadol. Now, why is it called Shabbas Hagadol? I have here, the Great Shabbos, I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Maybe in all seriousness, over 30 explanations of why it's called Shabbos Hagadol. This is the Great Shabbos. So the Tosfos gives several. We'll just go through some of them, just so people should be aware. If why is this called the Shabbos Hagadol? So Tosfos, the Shabbos 87a says that the day that the children of Israel left Egypt was Thursday, and so therefore on this goes back to when we were in Egypt. So on Thursday. Oh, actually, I just want to say before we say this. What percent, this is from today's Daf Yomi, not everybody did the Daf with us this morning. What percentage of Jews left Egypt? What percentage of Jews left Egypt? How many of the Jews left Egypt? It says there were 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60. So what percentage of them, of those 600,000 men, were the number of men who were in Egypt at that time? Anybody remember? We studied this a few times. The Rashi to Beshalach says that it was 1/5. That 1/5 went out of Egypt. That's the classic Rashi. But our Gemara is much more, I don't know what the word is, much less charitable, so to speak. Our Gemara says, Gemara in Sanhedrin 111 says, actually it says, Vilakachti vehiveti. I took you out and I brought you in. Who went into the land of Canaan? Only 2 out of the 600,000, Joshua and Caleb. And so the Gemara says, just like only 2 out of the 600,000 went into the land of Canaan, therefore only 2, we have the same ratio, only 2 went out of Egypt. So ratio of the Jews between the ages of 20 and 60, the males between the ages of 20 and 60, only 2 out of every 600,000, or 1 out of 300,000 was saved. And says the Gemara, and this should scare us all. When it comes time to the Messianic era, only 1 out of 300,000 will be saved. Only 1 out of 300,000 will be saved. So we see from here Very few of us are going to be redeemed, according to this Gemara. Very few. But it's not all is not lost. Because we could say that the greatest way we could be saved is the differentiator is our individuality. If we maintain our individuality, then we're more likely to be saved because it's an indication that the majority of the Jewish people are doing it wrong. The overwhelming majority are doing it wrong. And therefore, only 1 out of 300,000 will be saved. So we have to be that one. We have to be that one. Okay. So it states, so let's go back to the why was the Shabbas Hagadol? Why is the Shabbos called the Shabbas Hagadol? So the Tosfos, the Shabbos says that the children of Israel left Egypt on a Thursday. And so therefore, on a Wednesday, the day before they left, they slaughtered their Paschal lamb. And so therefore they needed to watch it. When did they take their lamb to watch it? They took it on Shabbos, because that was the 10th day. So 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, they had to watch it. You have to observe an animal for 4 days before slaughtering it on the 4th day. And so therefore, this is what they did. They required inspection for 4 days. So the day that they took the lamb for the first time was a Shabbos. And so Tosfos says that's why we call this Shabbos Hagadol, the great Shabbos, because of the great miracle that happened. That when they took the Shabbos, all of the nations of the world came over to the Jewish people and said, "Why are you doing this?" And they said, "We're doing and it's, especially all the firstborns." They said, "Why are you gathering? Why are you taking the lamb and tying it to your bedpost?" And so they said, "Because we're going to make a sacrificial offering to God, because God is going to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians." And so therefore, they went to their fathers and to Pharaoh to request from him that he should send out the Jewish people, and they still refused. And so therefore, the firstborns made a war against Pharaoh. There was a civil war, and many of the Egyptians ended up getting knocked off. And so therefore it says that they struck down many of the firstborns in a civil war before even the plague of the firstborn. And this is the source for the idea why it's called Shabbos Hagadol. You see, there's a whole civil war in Egypt we had no idea about until this source. So that's the first idea. Why is it called Shabbos Hagadol? Because of the great miracle which precipitated an Egyptian civil war. And the second source, so the first source is Tosfos writing in Northern Europe. The second source comes from the Tur. Tur lived in Spain, and he's in the 14th century. And he says, now what was the miracle? That it was Shabbos when they took their lamb, and they each one tied it to their bedpost. And the Egyptians asked them, "Why are you doing this?" And they responded, "In order to slaughter it for the purpose of the Korban Pesach that Hashem has commanded." And the Egyptian teeths were like, the Torah writes that their teeths were basically muted. They weren't able to respond over the fact that they slaughtered their gods. And so they weren't able to say anything. And on account of that miracle that we took their lamb, their god, and we slaughtered it, and they were unable to say anything, therefore it's called Shabbos Hagadol. So those are two explanations. One is because it was a great miracle that the Egyptians made a civil war and their firstborns died. The second reason is because of the great miracle was that the Egyptians weren't able to respond to us. Third explanation is from the Abudraham. Abudraham was 14th century Provençal, and he writes, why is it called the Shabbos Hagadol? Gadol means great. He says this was the first Shabbos that the Jewish people began to do the commandments. It says in the beginning of chapter 12 of Exodus, speak to the children of Israel on the 10th day of the month, and everybody should take a lamb for their household. And the 10th day of the month was Shabbos, because as we just established. And so therefore, since this was the very first time that we did a mitzvah, Therefore, this was the practice of celebrating this day as the Shabbos Hagadol, Gadol b'mitzvah. So the first day we did a mitzvah. Also, I want to mention that there's another, the first mitzvah a Jewish boy does is usually a bris, and he gets his circumcision. But another big early mitzvah can happen even before a bris. One of the things that can happen even before a bris is, let's say a child will be born today. Let's say someone will give birth to a baby boy today. So the bris is only 8 days later, but already will come the fast of the firstborn, and he'll have to fast. So this year, when is the fast of the firstborn? The practice is it's on Thursday. So because the firstborn, no matter the age, was killed, so therefore the practice is that even a minor has to fast, but the minor doesn't fast. So the custom is that the father fasts on his behalf. So that's another mitzvah that, just so you know, that can come even before a bris that a child has to do. Even before the bris, the child has to fast, and so therefore that's the context here. So if you're a firstborn and you don't want to fast, then you should come to our yeshiva this Thursday morning, because it works out actually that we're going to finish the tractate Sanhedrin, the Daf Yomi, this Wednesday, and the scene will be Thursday. It all works out nicely, and you could probably also join on Zoom if you don't want to come, although some say it's not good enough, but I say it's fine. Okay, so now we say a child that reaches the age of, so another explanation comes from the Mayana Shel Torah. Because let's say you have a child who reaches the age of 13, and he accepts upon himself the yoke of commandments. Once he becomes bar mitzvah, he's no longer called a katan, a minor. He's now called a gadol, an adult. So to the Jewish people, when they got their first mitzvah, we became bar mitzvah. This Shabbos is the Shabbos we became bar mitzvah, so to speak, and so therefore we're called gadol. And so this is the Shabbos of the gadol, the Shabbos in which we became bar mitzvah. So we as Jewish people became bar mitzvah. So that's the fourth explanation of why we read, of why it's called Shabbos Hagadol. Now we're up to the fifth explanation. The fifth explanation is based upon the Haftorah. This comes from the Matei Moshe, that the Haftorah comes from Malachi, and he says, "Hinei anochi sholeachachem es Eliyah hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanorah." That the Haftorah ends with the words, "Behold, I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet, and he will come on the day of Hashem Hagadol, the great day." So since the Haftorah ends with the words Hagadol, therefore we assume that this is called Shabbos Hagadol. So now we've seen 5 explanations. It's hard to remember all of them, so I hope you're writing them down. The 6th explanation comes from the Maharil. Maharil is 15th century, the Germanic lands, and he says it's called Shabbos Hagadol. So just like he says Yom Kippur is called Soma Rabbah. Why is Yom Kippur called the Great Fast? Because we have a lot of prayers and we have a lot of speeches. So this is called Shabbos Hagadol because we have a lot of drashas. The people, it used to be the case, everybody would go to synagogue on Shabbos Hagadol, and the rabbi would give an hour and a half to 2-hour drasha. And the rabbi gave a very long speech. That's why it's called the Great Shabbos, the Shabbos of the very long speech. So now we've seen 6 explanations. Now we come to the Shibbolei Aleket. Shibbolei Aleket is 14th century Italian, and he says the following. He says it's called Shabbos Hagadol because the people come home very late from synagogue that Shabbos because they're going to hear the rabbi speak, and the rabbi goes for a very long time because the drasha has to go over a lot of topics. It goes over topics of what's chametz and what's matzah, the laws of Pesach, the laws of the Exodus, and people don't leave to their homes until the drasha is finished, and so therefore the people start thinking that this day is longer than any other day, and so therefore they call it Shabbos Hagadol. So that's what the Shibbolei Aleket, basically the Maharil got it from the Shibbolei Aleket. He said now there's another explanation from the Tzeido Derech. Hold on, let me look up who the Tzeido Derech is. I forgot. Hold on. Let me look him up. Hold on, let me look it up. Okay. So the Tzeidah Derech is Rabbi Menachem ben Aaron ibn Zerach, and he is, well, there's a couple of Tzeidah Derech, actually. There's a couple of them. So he is probably Rabbi Menachem ibn Zeroach. And he was supported by the Abarbanel. Okay, so it's Spanish, basically 15th century. So he says that this Shabbos, he gives actually a couple of explanations. He says because the Gadol, who's the Gadol, the rabbi of the town, will give a drasha. And it's brought down, he says, in the Sefer Shabbos, he said, I heard from that since the other Shabbos, anybody can give a drasha because you don't have to, when you give the drasha in the synagogue, you don't have to talk about Jewish law. But this Shabbos, only the rabbi is allowed to speak. Every other Shabbos, he can have the people's pulpit. But this Shabbos, just the rabbi is allowed to speak. And so therefore, that's the answer of the Tzeidah Derech. The Bino Leitim gives another explanation. He says these are the days, any day where you study Torah is called great. Because it says, Ki be Yerbu Yamecha. And through Torah study, you become greater and greater and greater. And so this Shabbos, since more people come to hear the drasha, this Shabbos, it's called the Great Shabbos. And the practice is also to read the Haggadah this Shabbos. And so, the Rabbi Kasher gives an explanation that why is it called Shabbos Hagadol? That it's a misprint. That really it was brought down as Shabbos Hey Gimel Daled, which is Shabbos Haggadah, but then they started translating it as Shabbos Hagadol. Another explanation is from the Tzafnas Paneach, and he was the son of the Mabit. And the Mabit says, the Tzafnas Paneach says that when the Jewish people were in Egypt, Moshe initially asked Paro for 1 day of rest. Okay, I don't know what his source for this is, but this is a powerful source. He says the Jewish people initially asked Paro for 1 day of rest, and he said, what day? He said, Shabbos. They said, give us Shabbos off. And so they had Shabbos off even when they were in Egypt. However, every Motzi Shabbos, immediately after Shabbos, they had to get straight back to work. And all of their delight in the Shabbos turned into terrible pain and torture. But in this Motzi Shabbos, they never went back to work. And that's why it's called Shabbos Hagadol, meaning the long Shabbos. They didn't have to go back to work this Saturday night. That's why we have a practice that, typically speaking, there's a prayer that we say, it's called Vihi Noam. Vihi Noam was the blessing that Moshe gave to the Jewish people when the Mishkan was completed. He said, Vihi Noam Adonai Eino Masi Adenu Koneu Masi Adenu Koneu. Meaning to say, may your work of your hands be blessed by God. Typically speaking, we say that on Saturday night before we start to go out to work, because as long as Shabbos is going, as long as the Shabbos still is happening, the fires of Gehenna don't get started up again. It's only once Shabbos is over that the fires of Gehenna are cranked up again. And so therefore, we want to extend Shabbos as long as possible. And so since we want to extend Shabbos as long as possible, we say V'inoam to extend the prayers. But, however, let's say Yom Tif comes out in the middle of the week, anytime before Friday. So then you wouldn't say V'inoam. Why? Because then it doesn't pay to start the fires that week. Why? Because since it takes 3 days, or it takes 2.5 days to get the fires going, and then it takes a couple of days to wind the fires down, it's not worth it. If there's going to be a Yontif that week, we say the holiness of the Yontif is going to extend into the week, and so therefore we don't light the fires of Gehenna that week. And so therefore, and so therefore, since this was the first time that the Jewish people got, this was the first time that the Jewish people accepted, and it started on a Thursday. So the Shabbos before the Exodus was the first Shabbos that we didn't say that the Kedusha of the Shabbos extended into the week, and the fires of hell were not started. This was the first Shabbos in the history of the world that the fires of hell were not started after Shabbos. And so that's because this was the first time there was a Yontif. And so that's what the Chasam Sofer says. And so therefore, for this reason, it was called the Shabbos Hagadol. Okay, that's another explanation. Anyway, he has here another like 20 explanations, but I think we have enough. I think we have enough of the Shabbos Hagadol explanation. So we could go back to the text of our parsha, just putting out there some explanations. If somebody asks you why is it called Shabbos Hagadol, you could basically just summarize it by saying, well, the big three are that it's the Shabbos where we're supposed to study the Haggadah. It's the Shabbos where it's extra holiness because of the great miracle that happened in Egypt. It's also the Shabbos where the rabbi gives a very, very big drasha. So now going back to this idea, that we were speaking about at the beginning, before we got into the Shabbos Hagadol, is this concept of zrizus, of pushing ourselves to do a mitzvah, especially where there's financial loss. So first of all, I should point out that it's, like right now the stock market is in the tanks. I don't know if anybody noticed that, but every time the stock market is in the tanks, people say, look how much money I lost. First of all, you didn't lose any money because if it was in a stock, you didn't actually have it as a money, you just had it as a stock. But there's only one thing that you can never lose, and that is whatever you've given to charity. So the stocks you can always lose. Those things can go down, but whatever you've given, you can never lose. So that's a reminder to us that if we have the stock market, or if we say we're so proud of our stock market, fine. But that you can never, that's not your net worth. Your real net worth is what you've given, and that can never be taken away. So anybody who last week had a stock and was trading at $100 and now it's trading at 50, oh, what a bracha! That last week you gave it away to tzedakah, so you maximized your value of your stock, and now it's worth nothing. Doubly so. First of all, its value went down, and you lost the opportunity to give it away. Anyway, so the Sfas Emes says that especially the Torah urges. Rashi says, quote the words of the Rashi in case we forgot it. The words of the Rashi be Yoter tzarach hakosav lazares b'makom sheish bo chisaron kis. The Torah has to urge us to be even more careful when it comes to losing money. And here the Kohanim are the ones who are losing money because they're working and they're not making any money. Somebody trying to say something? Somebody cut in. Okay, so the Sfas Emes says this refers especially to the worst days of the Golus, when the Jews are denied nearly every opportunity. The Sfas Emes is writing in Poland in the 19th century. Jews are denied every opportunity to make a living. We have people were very poor. Now the Gerach Hasidim are some of the wealthiest. But so he says that's where it's the biggest test of our loyalty to the Torah, because that's when it's the hardest to observe it. And so therefore, Yoter tzarich hakosav lazares b'makom sheish bo chisaron kis. Nowadays in America, you go to any of these Pesach programs, which I have not gone to, and it costs like thousands of dollars for each person, and you see that they're all packed and they're all full, and they're in like such fancy places, like all around the world. People are in these places, and the test is where people are going to lose money. are they still going to be as sufficient, as dedicated to the observance of the Torah? The similar commandment, similar idea we see from the Chafetz Chaim, and not from the Chafetz Chaim, from the Kotzker Rebbe. Kotzker Rebbe says as follows. The Kotzker Rebbe says, again on the Rashi, we're still only commenting on the first Rashi. We haven't moved off the first Rashi. The first Rashi says, it says miyadu odoros. It says, what does the word zrizus mean? It means for now and for future generation. Ein tzav el lashon ziruz. The word command is an expression of urging for now and for all future generations. So says the Kotzker Rebbe, what's the reason? And this relates to Korban Pesach as well. Meaning to say as follows: who is it harder to engage in the Seder? Who is it harder to engage in the Seder? Is it harder to engage the person who is more mature and older, or is it harder to engage the little child, the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, the 6-year-old? So it's obviously, to my mind, much harder to engage the older adult. The older person who's an adult, is mature, it's perhaps grown stale. They might be cynical. You might have at your Seder a couple of people who are cynical already. So says the Kotzker Rebbe, since it's Ladoros, since the commandment is for all future generations, that's why when we do it, it has to be done with zrizos. When we do it, it has to be done with vigor, because the more the commandment is for future generations, there's the concern as we do something again and again and again that, God forbid, it should get stale. So that's why we say in our prayers that we say, Ashrei Yoshvei Veisecha. And we say, happy are we, how fortunate are we to serve. And we say we're fortunate to say the Shema multiple times a day. And we do this with affection each time, because it never grows stale. That's why we have an idea that the Talmud says, Gadol mitzvah va'osa mimisha einu mitzvah va'osa. It's a greater task to be commanded to do the mitzvah than somebody who's not commanded, because it's much more difficult to obey the commandment out of an obligation than out of just like a desire to do it. And you think about if you ever invited like a non-Jew to your Seder, if you ever have a non-Jew at your Seder and you have a Jew, who's going to be much more involved, much more interested in everything, much more curious? The person who's not commanded to do it. And so therefore, that's what the Kotzker Rebbe is saying here, that when it says it's an expression of zerizus, of urgency for now and for future generations, that's because there's the concern that, God forbid, it could grow stale. So we've seen now, okay, let me just actually summarize what we said to now, then we'll stop. We've seen why that the commandment is to do with urgency, because especially when there's a mitzvah, we have to do with urgency. Number two, we've seen that the commandment is, we saw why, thanks to April's question, why is the mem small, that the passion that we have for the performance of these mitzvahs has to be a private passion, not expressed to everybody. Then we went on a tangent and discussed several reasons for the Shabbas Hagadol. Why is it called Shabbas Hagadol, the great Shabbos? Why is it great? Because of the great miracle, because of the great Torah that we study, because of the fact that it's a special Haftorah, which uses the word Gadol. All of these are possible reasons, but the idea is that this is not a regular Shabbos, the great holiness that emanated from it. And now we say that it is the commandment has to be done, even though we lose money when performing the commandment. And also, it is the commandment that we have to be very careful about, says the Kotzker Rebbe, that we don't allow it to grow stale. So this is the idea of the that we discussed today. I don't believe that I'll be able to study with everybody this Wednesday, but I'm not sure yet. But there's a lot going on this Wednesday. But for now, we'll stop here for today. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address.